Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today I'm joined by Dr. Travis Dumsday, who is a philosophy professor at Concordia University of Edmonton. And we're going to be talking about evidentially compelling religious experiences, the argument from miracles for theism, and various other things in between. I've put links in the description to some of Travis's excellent work on these topics. He's got some interesting papers on religious experiences. He's got a recent book, The Marian Apparitions at Zeitoun, pronounced differently. I'll go with Zeitoun. How did you get interested in this? Just briefly, I'm curious.
Yeah, and thanks again for the invitation. I appreciate it. Well, I've always been interested in religious experiences or sort of paranormal experiences more broadly. And then part of what influenced also my academic work on it was that I've done a lot of work on a topic in natural theology called the problem of divine hiddenness, right? Which is basically the issue of like if God is supposed to be real, why doesn't he make himself more clearly known to more people, right? And so it's sort of the theological puzzle of why God doesn't provide us with more evidence or more direct contact with himself if he wants us to believe in him. And so that's always been sort of a theological issue that in Christianity, but in more recent philosophy of religion, it's also become a prominent argument for atheism, right? Which says that if God really existed, he would make himself openly, obviously known to everyone in a way that couldn't be rationally doubted, but he hasn't done this, and that's compelling evidence that he's not real. So I've done a lot of work on that problem over the years, and in a way, my interest in religious experiences is sort of like the mirror image of my interest in that problem, because, a lot of people do claim to have directly encountered either God himself or other sorts of non-natural or supernatural beings. And so it's this interesting puzzle. Like, claims of religious experience are actually extremely common across the population. There's a reticence to talk about them, especially in Western cultures. But if you look at, and psychologists and sociologists have done a huge amount of research on this over the last 50 years. And we have very good data from the United States, from Canada, from Great Britain that demonstrates pretty reliably that about 35% of the population will have a pretty powerful religious experience at some point over the course of their lives, which is a substantial portion of the population. So these experiences are actually pretty common. And yet, again, people don't like to talk about them. The fact that these experiences are so common is not well known precisely because there is a reluctance to discuss them publicly. People are afraid of being accused of deception or being called mentally unwell. Their experiences are often pathologized. Even though, again, they are common enough that it's absolutely obvious to psychologists of religion that these experiences are not rooted in pathology the vast majority of the time. So I've got these sort of two, again, sort of mirror image issues in philosophy of religion that I'm interested in, and my interest in one is sort of tied up in my interest in the other. So that's kind of how I got into the topic in part.
Yeah, and they raise lots of interesting philosophical questions. In epistemology and metaphysics, religious disagreement, how to weigh evidence, various things like that. So maybe let's start turning to some of those philosophical issues. I'll kind of let you take the reins.
Maybe I'll just start off by talking a bit about some of the issues more closely related to that book you kindly plugged earlier, The Marian Apparitions at Zeitoun. Yeah. In the literature on religious experience, different scholars use a variety of different sort of taxonomies or kind of conceptual maps for talking about different kinds or categories of religious experience. And among those categories that gets discussed is a division between what's sometimes referred to as private religious experiences versus intersubjective or group religious experiences or public religious experiences. So a private religious experience might be, imagine someone who's just praying, and while they're praying, maybe they're in church, while they're praying, they hear a voice that gives them some guidance or something, but nobody else hears the voice, right? It seems to be a purely private experience. Or they see a vision of an angel, but nobody else around them sees the same thing at the same time. So that'd be a private religious experience. An intersubjective religious experience would be where, like, you hear the voice, and it turns out that the people around you also hear the same voice at the same time, or you see the angel, and the people around you see the same thing at the same time, right? So you get these intersubjective or group experiences. And the reason why I think these intersubjective religious experiences, or one of the reasons why I think they're particularly worth talking about, especially for philosophers of religion who are interested in evidential questions and want to try to figure out, what metaphysical implications do such experiences have? Are they actually good evidence for the reality of non-natural or supernatural realms of being? Is that, of course, if intersubjective experiences are real, they undercut a wide variety of standard naturalistic explanations for religious experience, which are mostly focused on private experiences, as you'd expect, right? So for any private religious experience, there's always going to be a wealth of potential naturalistic explanations, right? In terms of a person's internal psychodynamics, or in terms of neurological factors or environmental factors, or any number of things. With intersubjective experiences, though, a lot of those proposed explanations start to look pretty weak, right? If 5 people are all claiming to have seen the angel Gabriel in the same place at the same time, it's unlikely that they're all having a private hallucination of the same thing, right? If the phenomenology really is basically the same, that's difficult to account for by reference to internal psychodynamic factors. And then, so you start to need to look at other kinds of explanation, and there's much less work done in the skeptical literature on trying to account for these intersubjective experiences. And I think the work that has been done, in my opinion, is not particularly compelling, particularly when we're talking about mass religious experiences. So in other words, where you're dealing not just with a small group of people who claim to be experiencing the same supernatural entity or event at the same time, but when you're talking about hundreds or thousands of people claiming to experience the same thing at the same time. And so the focus of that book, The Marian Apparitions at Zeitoun, is on the largest mass religious experiences in modern recorded history, which took place from April 1968 through May 1971 in a suburb of Cairo, Egypt, called Zeitoun. And so basically what happened there was, beginning on April 2nd, the evening of April 2nd, 1968, people began seeing this glowing, floating female figure above St. Mary's Coptic Orthodox Church in Zeitoun. And the initial witnesses to this event were mostly Muslim. I mean, Egypt's a 90% majority Muslim country today, as it was back then. But nevertheless, these events became word of these events quickly became known in the neighborhood, and moreover, this glowing, floating female figure started reappearing on succeeding evenings. Not in any regular pattern, but regular enough that you started to get tens of thousands of people camping around the church every night. The Egyptian government had to tear down the public transit station across the street from the church to make more room for people who were crowding in to see these events. And so, and these events were widely covered by the Egyptian media at the time. Scholars from the American University in Cairo were writing about them as they were happening. Folks like Otto Meinardus and Cynthia Nelson were writing about these events as they were occurring. And so we have really good both scholarly and journalistic sources on these events as they were occurring. We have a wealth of direct eyewitness testimony from the time, both from the time the events were occurring, and also in succeeding decades as researchers have talked to eyewitnesses and recorded their testimony. And so we know that massive numbers of people saw these phenomena, which included not just the glowing, floating female figure that was generally identified as the Virgin Mary, or assumed to be the Virgin Mary by the witnesses, but also other anomalous lights, bizarre sort of clouds floating around the church that people were seeing, these glowing, floating figures that were thought to be the sort of dove-shaped entities. And of course, a huge range of also claims of miraculous healings taking place while all this was going on, which were investigated by a medical commission set up by the Coptic Patriarchate at the time. Again, some of which were extremely well documented. So with all this, so basically these events started again spring 1968. They were occurring at greatest frequency during roughly the first year of the events. After that, they sort of gradually tapered off. And by the time of the final event in May 1971, the crowds assembled at the church had really petered out because the events were occurring much less frequently. But researchers who tried to figure out, overall how many people saw these events while they were occurring over the course of this 3-year period, I've seen different numerical estimates, some higher, some lower. I think Daniel Fanu in his 2019 book has a pretty reasonable estimate of about 1 million people who witnessed one or another sort of seemingly supernatural occurrence at this church over the course of these events. And so in the book, what I'm doing is just sort of reviewing the history of these events, both the events themselves, but also the historical context in which they were taking place. Looking at a wide assortment of sample eyewitness testimonies of what was going on, and then just running through the whole series, looking at the various scientific explanations that have been suggested for what might have been going on, and trying to argue that none of these scientific explanations, these are sort of naturalistic explanations, are particularly convincing. And so the upshot of the book, the overarching argument or thesis of the book, is that at the moment, this particular series of mass religious experiences in Egypt constitute pretty good evidence for the reality of the supernatural. Not definitive. It's always possible someone might come up with a much better scientific explanations for what was going on. But I think at the moment, the way the evidence stands, these occurrences are actually pretty evidentially compelling.
Awesome. So we've got kind of, as I see it, two main planks of this case. First, establishing the relevant data or the evidence in question, right? The stuff to be explained. And then secondly, proposing and comparing various explanations, some of which are going to be naturalistic, some of which are going to be non-naturalistic. I know you mentioned various bits of data, but maybe let's camp out a little bit on some of the data. So we seem to have, I think it's in the number of thousands of eyewitness testimonial reports, right? Including ones that were collected afterwards, but also tons that were collected at the time. Wasn't there like a rolling newspaper which included like firsthand eyewitness accounts that were taken down by journalists?
Yeah. So there's a French scholar, Sandrine Kariakos, whose work I cite in the book, and she actually did the painstaking work of just combing through the Arab language media at the time, and just literally she counted up all the eyewitness testimonies that were printed in this particular newspaper that had a special focus on these events, and she counted more than 2,400 eyewitness testimonies that were published as these events were occurring.
And that's just in the Arabic newspaper, right?
Yeah.
Right. So then we've also got a number of different testimonies in French and in English by people from all different strands of society as well.
Yeah, and there was a little bit. I mean, by and large, the Western media didn't pay a whole lot of attention to these events as they were occurring, but there was some coverage. So the New York Times, for example, did a story on Zeitoun in April 1968, and reported that their reporter, the wording he used was that countless Egyptians had seen these seemingly supernatural events at the church at the time. Reuters, the wire service, did some reporting on this at the time as well. So there was some wider media attention, but by and large, it's still especially the Arabic language Egyptian press at the time that was focusing on it.
Another aspect of the data is like photographic stuff and potential paucity of that. We'll get to that in a second, but I just want to lay out the data for the audience. So again, you kind of did a brief tour through some of these phenomena, but I just want to camp on them. So we've got a number of different seemingly kind of anomalous phenomena being testified to very consistently across these testimonial reports, both immediately after the events, on the nights on which they occurred, the days afterwards, and the subsequent years where people did various different investigations, talking to witnesses and whatnot. Some of the things that were testified to include, as you said, these luminous dove-like objects where people just describe them as being the shape of a dove or shape of a pigeon. Oftentimes, people would actually describe seeing them kind of like materialize, like they would see them spontaneously appear and then fly through the air without flapping their quote-unquote wings, right? Sometimes they would fly in formation, sometimes in the shape of a cross. And also, people testified to seeing these things just kind of spontaneously fizzle out, kind of spontaneously disappear. So that's the doves. There were also the various healings that you mentioned. There was a medical commission set up to investigate a number of the different healings. I'd like you to maybe walk us through those in a second, but I just want to lay this out for the audience. Thirdly, we have the kind of main apparition, the female figure that is amply testified to, including, we have ample testimonies to like intentional movements on the part of this figure, including walking, blessing, kneeling before the cross, holding different objects and whatnot. And then we have different like anomalous cloud phenomena that was pretty amply attested to, together with like a deep and beautiful scent of incense pervading the area. That's very well attested to as well. And then I guess a final thing that I'll mention is just like different, somewhat anomalous light phenomena that didn't take distinctive shapes. Like sometimes you would see that people did testify to seeing balls of light or various other anomalous light phenomena, in addition to a distinctive female figure. I don't know if you want to add anything, but I'm hoping you can maybe like take us through some of these. So like, what are some of these healings? Like, I'll turn it over to you.
Maybe what I'll do is just read out one or two case studies that the medical commission report highlighted. Just taking a moment to bring this up, sorry.
That's all good. I mean, I'll mention one, maybe this is one that you will cover, but the first person who like saw the apparition kind of pointed to it. It was like the transit worker, right? The Muslim transit worker on the first night pointed to it, and he had a bandaged finger, which was gangrenous. The initial people, they thought it was just like a nun who was about to commit suicide, right? So they literally like called the cops, and they were kind of freaking out. I mean, you don't call the cops on an amorphous blob of light. So they were kind of scared at that point. They're like, oh no, they're like, don't jump. They were like shouting that. And then I think it was the next day or something because the guy had a scheduled amputation for his gangrenous finger, because, you know, it's gangrenous. It doesn't heal naturally. You have to amputate it. But when the doctors opened up the bandaging, his finger was healed. Maybe that was one of the ones that you're going to cover. If so, you can give his name and various other details. But I just thought that one was kind of cool. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, and that one is definitely worth mentioning for a couple of reasons, in part because it was the very first recorded supposed miraculous healing associated with these events. Yeah, the guy's name was Farouk Muhammad Atwa. And not only was it the first healing, but it was the first healing of a Muslim associated with these events. And, you know, you might wonder, you know, like in a 90% Muslim majority country, how are these massive crowds going to feel about seeing this seemingly supernatural figure hovering above a church? You know, you might wonder, well, is there going to be hostility? Is there going to be resistance to these events? But remarkably, you know, the Egyptian Muslim community totally embraced these events as they were happening. It actually became a source of amazing kind of interreligious harmony, ecumenical unity. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is precisely because so many Muslims were reporting healing. And so, yeah, that's definitely a case worth highlighting. Just to give the audience one or two other just quick examples, and I'm drawing these from, so this is from the medical commission set up by the Coptic Patriarchate. It was headed by Dr. Shafiq Abdel Malek, who was a professor of medicine at the University of Cairo and the personal physician to the Coptic Orthodox Pope, Kyrillos VI. So here's an excerpt from the medical commission report. This is cited in Pearl Zaki's 2002 book. So I'll just read this out. It's like a short paragraph. Quote, Inshira Amin Al-Nayal, wife of Mahmoud Shukri Ibrahim, director of the Roads and Bridges Department, both Muslims, living at 13 Abdel Rahman El-Barkuri Street, Manial El-Roda in Cairo, had been suffering from a serious paralysis of the left leg and could walk only by the help of a stick. She went to the church in her car on April the 29th, accompanied by her husband. Both prayed, but nothing happened that night. The following night, she went again, accompanied by her son, and again watched for the appearance of the Virgin, praying fervently. After some time, she saw a cloud on the dome at the northeast, which gradually took the form of the Virgin, and began to circulate around the dome. Inshira cried, "O Mother of Light, help me." Her son, Ahmed, was so affected by the apparition that he fell from his chair. At dawn, the lady got up, carried her chair, and walked steadily on her 2 feet without using her stick or leaning on her son. She went to her car rejoicing in the Lord. Dr. Abbas Azad, Dr. Ali Labib, and Dr. Muhammad Saeed, who had examined her earlier and found her paralysis irremediable, were amazed at her miraculous cure, unquote. Another example Zaki cites is actually the cure of a medical doctor, which is interesting. So here's another quote. Dr. William Neshadzaki, ex-director of Masara Unit for Medical Treatment, whose clinic is at 41 Shubra Street in Cairo, had been suffering greatly for 13 years from a hernia, for which he had been forced to wear a medical belt. He says in his report that he despaired of a medical cure. On the night of May the 30th, he went to the church at Zeitoun. He says, "Just before dawn, I saw the Blessed Virgin. She was moving towards the cross. Then she stretched out her hand and blessed us. I prayed for a miraculous cure through her intercession. When I reached home, no pain of any sort was bothering me. The hernia had been completely cured." Unquote. There's one more just sort of example I'd like to give. This is not from the official medical report produced by the Coptic Patriarchate. Instead, this is from an article by Dr. Cynthia Nelson. She was a professor of anthropology at the American University in Cairo who developed an interest in the apparitions as they were occurring. And so she interviewed a number of eyewitnesses. She talked to a number of people. One of the people she talked to was a surgeon in Cairo. And here's what I'll just read a short excerpt from Dr. Nelson's article from 1973. So here's what she says. One prominent Cairo surgeon expressed this existential dilemma in the following narrative. Okay, so now she's quoting from this Cairo surgeon that she interviewed. Quote, "A patient of mine upon whom I'd operated 2 years ago for cancer returned to my office 3 weeks ago for a checkup. Upon examination, I discovered that the man had another tumor. I actually felt the tumor during the internal examination and removed a piece of tissue for biopsy. When the test showed it was malignant, I recommended an immediate operation, but the man refused, saying he did not have enough money, and left the office. 2 weeks later, he returned and asked for another examination. To my astonishment, I could not find the tumor, but only some white scar tissue. The man told me he had gone to Zeitoun and prayed to the Virgin for help. I do not believe in such miracles, but I cannot explain the disappearance of the tumor, and it's driving me mad." So that was this surgeon that Nelson had interviewed as the apparitions were occurring. So that just gives your audience some flavor of the kinds of miracle healing reports that emerged from these events.
Right, and the commission, they have various medical documentation that they required, and they collected that. They collected eyewitness statements and various other things. I've actually looked into some of these. They're actually pretty interesting. I was like, oh my gosh, this is kind of cool. And this is part of the data that any systematic explanation of the phenomena surrounding Zeitoun would need to explain. So I think it's important to lay that on the table. Guys, I have a confession to make. Mary appeared to me last night and told me that I, and you too, should donate to FarmKind. Okay, before you skip forward, maybe that didn't happen. But if Mary appeared to me, that's definitely what she would say. As you can tell, I'm really excited for the sponsor of today's video because it's a charity that I donate to, and I want to explain why. You've probably heard about the conditions of animals on factory farms. I won't scandalize you with the details, but if factories treated dogs or cats that way, we would immediately recognize the wrongdoing. Over 99% of farmed animals in the US are on factory farms, and the vast majority of people, over 90%, say they oppose the conditions on these farms.
I mean, look at all those chickens. They're not being factory farmed. They're happy.
And here's the thing. We can actually save animals from unnecessary cruelty by donating to the most effective charities working to end factory farming. This is where FarmKind comes in. Based on thousands of hours of expert research, they recommend some of the best charities with excellent track records. It's very important to donate to this cause, right? Don't be like all those dirty capitalists who hoard all their money and so on, right? If you donate through FarmKind, say you donate $15, then they give all of that money to those recommended charities that are freeing millions of animals from things like battery cages, extremely painful procedures without anesthetic, inhumane slaughter methods, and so on. And you can actually see your impact because FarmKind calculates in expectation how many animals your donations will help per year. It's pretty cool that so little money can completely transform the lives of this many animals per year. So if you want to donate as well, please use the link in the description because your donation will get a 50% boost thanks to the pledges of large donors. Thanks. I don't know if you wanted to say anything else about the doves or the figure before we get to talking briefly about the photographs. Actually, maybe because you mentioned Cynthia Nelson, I'll bring up the question that I wanted to ask about Cynthia Nelson.
Yeah.
So I'm curious what you make about some of like the skeptics of Zeitoun, or like, at least miracle skeptics, who kind of emphasize some of like the testimonial variance and like perhaps conflict that was reported at the time. So like especially the Cynthia Nelson case. As you said, she visited the church site on several occasions, but she didn't report seeing anything that could be identified clearly as an apparition of the Virgin Mary or a female figure, it seems. She did say on one occasion that she saw a few intermittent flashes of light, and then on another occasion she said she saw the glow of some kind of figure of an ambiguous shape shining through palm trees, but it left her field of vision relatively quickly. So, and notably, she was present on June 1st, according to her testimony, which was the same night described by one of the bishops who testified to the Zeitoun events, Bishop Gregorius, right? And Gregorius was explicit that he saw a discernibly female figure several times that night. And that seems to kind of potentially clash with Nelson's testimony to only seeing a kind of amorphous, anomalous lights or something like that. And maybe more generally, the skeptic will say, like, perhaps this indicates that, listen, religious fervor just led people to interpret relatively amorphous light stimuli as the Virgin Mary. And maybe this interpretation was kind of solidified by later memory distortions upon retelling and reliving the experience. So I'm curious how you would respond to a skeptic who's pushing these sorts of thoughts.
Yeah, it's good to go through this because Nelson's account really is quite interesting. You've got this, so far as I'm aware, secular professor of anthropology who nevertheless became interested in these events. Again, went out and talked to people, talked to eyewitnesses, and on a couple of occasions, again, did see something herself. So maybe what I'll do is I'll actually read a little bit from her article just so the audience has a sense of, again, what she herself was claiming to have experienced on a couple of occasions. So this is from her 1973 article. This is reporting her own experience at the apparition site. Quote, "As we were talking, the crowd began pointing to the palm trees and exclaiming, 'It's the Virgin. She looks like a nun. She's swaying to and fro as if she were blessing us.' When I looked to where the crowds were pointing, I too thought I saw a light through the branches of the trees. And as I tried to picture a nun-like figure in those branches, I could trace the outline of a figure. But as I thought to myself, this is just an illusion of the light reflecting through the branches, the image of the nun would leave my field of vision. Still, there was no doubt in my mind that there was a light, and that if I looked for the image, it would come into focus. I immediately explained this perceptual experience as an illusion caused by reflected light, but the source of the light was a mystery, for the street lights had been disconnected all around the church for several days, and within another week, all the trees around the church would be cut," unquote. That was an earlier experience in April. She kept returning to the church on several other occasions, including June 1st, the feast of the Flight of the Holy Family. That was the one you were mentioning that Bishop Gregorios had also been present at. Here's her report from that night. Quoting from my field notes of June 1st, 1968, "I arrived at Zeitoun at 10 p.m. and stayed until 2 a.m., accompanied by 3 Egyptian women friends, 2 Muslims, and a Copt. There were intermittent flashes of light, perhaps headlights, I inquired. I was told by the crowd that for the past 2 weeks there had been no buses or cars allowed near the area. The crowd's response to those flashes of light was electric. They clapped and shouted, 'There she is, there she is.' On the whole, the atmosphere seemed more subdued, reserved than in the early days of May. One woman sitting next to me told me she had been to Zeitoun for the past 3 days and nights, but tonight, the anniversary of the Holy Family's visit to Egypt in the 1st century, was the first time she had seen anything," unquote. I spend a fair amount of time in the book talking about Nelson's reports and how it compares to what other people reported on that same night. And yeah, it is puzzling, some of the discrepancies, right? And the argument I end up making is that I think in this particular case, there are some prosaic explanations for those discrepancies.
For the audience, what is prosaic explanation?
Oh, sorry, just like ordinary, easily understandable factors that explain these differences. And I think on that particular night, part of what was going on was that some of the more dramatic stuff was happening earlier in the evening. If I recall correctly, I think sorry, I should have double-checked this earlier, but I believe what happened was some of the more dramatic things on that particular night had occurred earlier. Nelson got there 10 p.m., stayed till 2 a.m., seemingly things had kind of calmed down after that. So you do sometimes get these discrepancies between eyewitness reports, even on what's happening on the same night. And I have an extended discussion in the book as to what I think is going on. And my overarching take on it is that I think for the most part, those discrepancies can be explained by reference to prosaic factors, right? The fact that over the course of a single night, you might get different phenomena occurring. people situated around the church, some had better vantage points than others. Moreover, the phenomena itself was quite variable, right? So, for example, it was often reported that you would get the figure of the Virgin gradually appearing, right? What you would sometimes get was like a ball of light that would gradually take the form of the Virgin, and then that would appear for a while, and then she would sort of, I don't want this to sound impious, but like the figure would sort of shrink back into a ball of light gradually, or like dim out into something else. That was one kind of form of appearance. At other times, this is very interesting. Sometimes people would report that the apparition would begin as like a horizontal line of light. The analogy one eyewitness used was like if you're in a dark room and you look underneath a door, like a line of light you get underneath the doorway. He said it started out like that, and then it gradually grew out, and the figure of the Virgin sort of appeared out of that. And I've seen other eyewitness reports that report independent witnesses who say exactly the same thing, like this particular mode of appearance. So I think sometimes what's going on, where you get people who report like, well, they saw something, but it was only sort of dim. Other people reporting that they saw something more clear or more impressive. I think part of what's going on is that you've got thousands of people assembled around the church. You've got people jostling for position. At some points people were able to see more clearly, but at some points also what they were seeing was this might have been the figure during the period of fading out. And so what they were seeing would have been more of like an amorphous blob of light. Whereas others who might have been in a better position 10 minutes earlier saw something much more clearly defined. So I think that accounts for most of the variances in what people are reporting. And I think in particular, in my opinion, looking at a large range of these reports that were available to me, that the consistencies I think are more impressive than some of these discrepancies. I mean, I have seen others suggest that what may have been going on, especially in the later periods of these events, was that it may be that. So I've seen Coptic theologians, for example, suggest that while the early period of events were sort of fully intersubjective, like everybody was seeing this basically the same thing at the same time, as the course of events progressed over the succeeding years, it may be that some people were seeing things fully, whereas others were seeing less. Maybe God was sort of revealing these events more clearly to some people than others, perhaps for moral reasons. So in other words, there's a suggestion that some of these events might have been sort of partially intersubjective or variably intersubjective, right? You've got people experiencing something at the same time, but the content of what they're experiencing might be different from person to person. I've seen that suggested, especially for some of the later events in Zeitoun. But in my opinion, though, I don't think that's what was going on. I think these events were actually fully intersubjective. Everyone was basically experiencing the same thing at the same time. And that the variations, I think, are explicable by reference to the kinds of ordinary perceptual factors that I alluded to before. Again, that's my opinion. I can understand how someone might come to a different conclusion looking at some of the same data, but plowing through a whole bunch of these eyewitness testimonies, I think that's the most reasonable explanation for some of those differences.
I do at least want to caution people against kind of just like naively throwing out massive amounts of mutually corroborating testimony to like distinctively female-shaped figure, discernibly female-shaped figure, various other phenomena, just because we can find among the thousands of accounts some divergences where, like, even with the divergences, like there's an agreement that like there were anomalous light phenomena where it's no one knew the source of it or whatever. They oftentimes like would shut down the power for the neighborhood and whatnot. And even though they did that, the relevant lights and whatnot would still appear. People would still see the apparition and whatnot. I just would caution people against throwing out massive amounts of generally consistent, independently corroborating testimony just because we can find some cases of divergence, especially when there are various prosaic factors. Like sometimes the crowds got up in the thousands and even potentially the tens of thousands. And I even heard some people estimate that on the most populous nights, sometimes it might have even gotten up into the hundreds of thousands. It's like people had to like fight the crowds. Trees sometimes might have gotten in the way and they had to cut those down. Like they're just, people are positioned differently, looking at it. attending differently. There are just like lots of prosaic factors that could account for this sort of thing. And it's just a very humdrum feature of testimonial reports that oftentimes there's divergence based on prosaic factors, and that doesn't impugn the overall preponderance of evidence of what people were testifying to independently and corroborating one another on it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you might add to that is just, if you've got some friends who go to, I don't know if young people still go to rock concerts, but if you go to a rock concert, right? Let's say you've got 50,000 people crowding around, and you've got a group of people in like a mosh pit or something in front of the stage, and you quiz them afterwards about what was going on at a given time, or what one of the band members was wearing, or something like this, or what was happening at a given point. Of course, you're going to get some variation, some even seeming inconsistencies, just because of these prosaic factors, right? People are getting jostled around. Some people have a better vantage point than others. Some people have better eyesight than others, right? There's a whole variety of things that go into this. So just as you're going to get inevitable variances in perfectly ordinary large group events, you're going to get the same thing here. I mean, I'm not saying that accounts for all of the variations that I talk about in the book, but I think that reasonably explains quite a bit of it.
Awesome. So the final thing on the data portion, right? So again, for the audience, I mentioned these two planks, one of which is the data plank or the evidence plank, another of which is the comparing explanations plank. The final thing in the data that I want to talk about is maybe just like the photographs, right? So I have here one of, I believe this is actually one of like the original photographs before touching up. This was by a named individual, Ali Ibrahim. We have the night that he testified to taking the picture. You can see at the top the kind of one of the dove-like figures that people were testifying to. There were lots of photos of those as well. I mean, it's very, very bright. People testified to it being like extremely luminous. But in the middle is supposed to be the apparition, right? So you got like the halo, and then if you've seen the pictures where it's touched up, you can kind of make out the female figure. But this one, it's harder to make out. So I'm just giving the audience a sense of like that there are indeed at least claimed pictures of this. I'm curious what you make of the picture evidence. Can you just talk us through this, say something about it?
Yeah. So I've seen about a dozen alleged photos that were taken at the time. The most complete collection I've come across of those photographs is, again, in Pearl Zaki's book. Zaki is her surname, Pearl Zaki. She traveled to the apparition site at the time, and then wrote a book about it afterwards. And in her book, she includes all of the published photographs. And her book is actually a particularly good source for the photos, because she's, so far as I'm aware, she's just directly reproducing the photos that were published in the Egyptian newspapers at the time. So what you'll find in her book is just direct print reproductions of the newspaper material. The reason that's worth noting is that there are versions of the photograph floating around online that, as you pointed out, have been sort of touched up or altered electronically. So you got to be careful with some of the versions of the photographs online. Again, I would recommend getting her book as just a more reliable.
Yeah, I think that one was actually taken from her book, but I can confirm that later.
Yeah, that one I think was. Yeah, the one you showed, I think was. But just there are some floating out there that are touched up. Now there's debate about this. So there's an American physicist, John Jackson, who co-wrote a book with his wife and a Coptic researcher, a man named Yusuf Kamel, back in the 90s, who traveled to Zeitoun in 1986 to interview people and collect evidence. And part of his book includes an extended discussion of the photographs. He sort of applied some of his specialist knowledge of optics, and he worked with some photographic experts to analyze the photographs and try to determine if they showed any evidence of having been doctored. And basically, now I don't have the expertise to assess Jackson's work, and it would be nice if somebody else could sort of look at this in a detailed way and give a more updated assessment. But Jackson's report basically was that, so far as he could ascertain, some of the photos were authentic, showed no technical evidence of having been doctored or messed with. Others he thought had been. And so his book is probably the most detailed resource on the question of the photographic evidence. Now, one obvious question. So anyway, that's all I can really say, and I get into this to some extent in the book, basically just going over some of that, some of Jackson's work. So what to think of the photographs, I'm not exactly sure. I'm inclined to think some of them probably are authentic, but there is obviously the follow-up question to be asked, which is, namely, you had hundreds of thousands of people assembled on some nights around this church, right? The Egyptian Gazette noted that on the anniversary of the first sighting of the apparition, so this is like April 2nd, 1969, the Egyptian Gazette reported there were 250,000 people crowded around the church on that night. So it gives you some sense of what the crowds were like on some evenings. And so you might wonder, if there's so many people, I mean, surely some of them had cameras. There were a lot of professional journalists who were there. Why don't we have a lot more photographic evidence? Why don't we have any? So far as I'm aware, there's no video evidence, no live video feed. So if these events are objectively, like, physically real, corporeal or semi-corporeal in some way, it's a good question to ask of, wouldn't you expect more photographic evidence to be available? I don't really know the right answer to that. It's a good question. I did read, so there is one French researcher, a Roman Catholic priest named Francois Brune, who wrote a book on not just Zeitoun, but sort of Marian apparitions in Egypt generally. It was published in French in 2004, and Brune traveled to Egypt, interviewed a whole bunch of people, interviewed eyewitnesses, and interviewed some of the people who'd taken these photographs. And Brune claims that, according to people he spoke to, there were lots more people who tried to take photos. And then afterwards, when they developed the film, nothing showed up. So in other words, what Brune's claim was that lots and lots of Egyptian journalists were there with cameras. They were competent journalists. They took photographs of things they were seeing with their own eyes at the time. But then when they developed the photographs afterwards, nothing showed up. It's hard to know what to make of that. Again, the only source I've found for that is Francois Brune. So we kind of have to take his word for it and the people he was talking to. So that's another interesting piece of evidence, right? That might speak to this question of why isn't there more photographic evidence? But then if that's the case, is that evidence that all the photographs are inauthentic? Or is it evidence that, on some evenings, for some reason, this being was capable of being photographed and other evenings not? Why would that be? And there's a lot of interesting sort of follow-up questions one could ask. And of course, this is just as a sort of addendum to that point. This is actually a much larger, widely discussed question for, like, paranormal research generally, right? I mean, for example, there's lots of photographs out there allegedly of ghosts, right, from supposed haunted sites. There's also lots of other people who claim they saw something weird in their house. They took a photograph and nothing showed up. Same exact point applies to a lot of alleged UFO sightings. Obviously, there's tons and tons of alleged photographic and video evidence of UFOs, but there's also tons of reports of people who claim to see something bizarre in the sky, took a photograph or a cell phone video, and then that afterwards nothing showed up. What's going on with all this? I don't know. There's some interesting sort of metaphysical questions one could ask about this sort of thing, and I'm not sure exactly how best to answer that.
Yeah, it's a bit puzzling. I mean, so when I put on my my skeptical naturalist hat and I try to give an explanation for Zeitoun, which maybe this is a good bridge because we've laid out some of the evidence, right? Just like thousands of testimonial reports of these various things. Some photographs, which we have at least some reason to think are genuine, but certainly not dispositive or conclusive reason to think are genuine. But still, everyone agrees a paucity, at least in general, a paucity of photographic and video evidence. That's kind of part of the data. Let's turn to the comparing explanations. I mean, if with my skeptical naturalist hat on, I would want to say something like, there has to be some sort of objective element to this. I mean, there was some sort of light phenomena going on over an extended period of time. But then, once we grant that there was some sort of objective phenomenon going on, it seems like even the naturalist hypotheses very poorly explain the paucity of photographic evidence. Like, wouldn't we also predict under a naturalistic hypothesis that we would have had way more photos than we in fact do? Like, isn't it very strange that even under the naturalistic hypothesis, people thought that they were seeing the Virgin Mary appearing, and according to these hypotheses, which posit some objective light elements, there should have been way more photographs of it. So, like, I don't know, it seems like insofar as it's a serious problem for the miracle hypothesis, it seems like it would also be a problem for what I take to be the most plausible naturalistic hypotheses, which posit some objective phenomenon which people would have been able to picture. So anyway, that's something that I'll lay out there on the table.
Yeah, and that same French scholar I mentioned before, Francois Brune, makes that same point actually, and he says that, in his opinion, the lack of photographic evidence is in a way supportive of the supernatural status of the apparition, because in his opinion it tells against hoax hypothesis, right? So if, for example, these images were somehow being like technologically produced, right? Somebody had some kind of a super high-tech 3D hologram technology or something like this at work, or something lower tech, some kind of magic trick. In the book, I do argue that those hoax explanations are not very compelling, but
yeah, we'll get to that.
If that was what was going on, yeah, there would have been no problem photographing something artificially produced and projected onto the roof of the church. So that's also maybe worth mentioning.
Awesome. So let's go through some of the explanations. So I kind of want to focus on maybe 3 naturalistic explanations. So first would be the tectonic strain theory, because that's what at least a number of like popular people mention, popular skeptics, and I think it's in like the Wikipedia entry or whatever. So tectonic strain theory. So we'll go through that. Secondly, I want you to comment on purely psychogenic explanations, which don't posit any objective correlate to the experiences and testimonial reports. And then thirdly, some kind of technological hoax hypothesis. So let's just go through those in order, starting with tectonic strain theory.
Yeah. So very briefly, so tectonic strain theory is a theory developed by the late Canadian neuroscientist Michael Persinger. And Persinger originally developed this theory in the 1970s as an explanation for the UFO phenomenon. So there are 2 components to tectonic strain theory. There's a geological component and there's a neuroscientific component. So the geological component basically runs as follows. So in geology, there's this phenomenon known as earthquake lights. So basically, during a severe earthquake, an earthquake can, for complex geological reasons, prompt brief sparks of light in the sky produced by the tectonic forces, right? So there are weird lights that can occur briefly during the acute stage of an earthquake. They're known as earthquake lights. Persinger took that and hypothesized that, what if much lower levels of tectonic activity, right? So levels of tectonic strain, like well below that of an earthquake, but still like higher than usual tectonic strain. He hypothesized that too could give rise to anomalous lights in the atmosphere, right? In other words, lower levels of tectonic strain could give rise to these anomalous blobs of light that are objectively real, right? That they actually exist as real light phenomena in the atmosphere, but they're being produced solely by these geological forces. So that's the geological component of the theory, right? And Persinger thought that, so he argued this accounts for a lot of UFO sightings. And in fact, he tried to argue for this by looking at supposed UFO flaps, right, where a given region is experiencing an unusually high level of UFO sightings. He tried to correlate UFO flaps with tectonic strain, right? So he would look at geological data tables and try to correlate them with these periods of higher than usual flying saucer sightings. That's the geological component of the theory. Now, the neuroscientific side of the theory, basically what Persinger suggests is that this same, so what happens, the geological activity prompts changes in the ambient electromagnetic environment. That's what gives rise to these anomalous blobs of light that are objectively real. Okay. Going back to his original work on the UFO phenomenon, Persinger recognizes, okay, the geological component of the theory explains what's known as close encounters of the first kind, right, where people are just seeing weird lights in the sky. What about close encounters of the third kind, where people claim to see these weird lights in the sky that land and strange beings get out, right? Persinger suggests, well, it's unlikely that all those people are lying or crazy. So what's going on here? What he suggests is now the second component of his tectonic strain theory, which is there is a subset of the population whose brains are particularly susceptible to shifts in ambient electromagnetic activity, right? So shifts in the wavelengths of electromagnetic activity in the environment. So when you get dramatic shifts in that electromagnetic ambient activity due to these geological phenomena, there's going to be a subset of the population that is probably going to see these weird lights in the sky that are objectively real. But then as a result of their brains encountering the shifts in ambient electromagnetic activity, some of these people are going to start having much more dramatic hallucinations, where given their cultural background, what they will hallucinate is a flying saucer landing and weird beings come out, right? Because that's just the culture we live in right now, right? Maybe hundreds of years ago, they would have seen a religious figure. Now they're going to hallucinate alien beings. But it's only a subset of the population, right? That has what Persinger referred to as temporal lobe lability, right? Where it's a particular susceptibility of people's brains to, again, these shifts in ambient electromagnetic activity that prompt these private hallucinations. Okay, so that's Persinger's overarching explanation for various components of the UFO phenomenon. Out of that, he developed a kind of generic all-purpose theory for paranormal and religious experiences, both private and group experiences. So in 1989, Persinger and a colleague named John Dare wrote a paper on Zeitoun that they published in a respected psychology journal called Perceptual and Motor Skills, where in that 1989 paper, they applied tectonic strain theory to the Zeitoun apparitions. And what they argued was, at the time, Egypt was going through unusually high levels of tectonic strain. And so what's going on is that there were real objective anomalous lights that people were actually seeing at Zeitoun that were being produced by these geological factors. And then the more detailed perceptual phenomena, like the glowing, floating, specifically female figure, that was being produced by these portion of the population with this temporal lobe lability that were having these more complex hallucinations. So this is how Persinger accounts for group religious experiences, right? There is something real there that groups of people are actually seeing, but then a subset of those people are going to see something more detailed. And that's going to be produced by, again, private hallucinations influenced by cultural factors. So what Persinger suggested was, because Egypt was so heavily religious, when they're seeing these glowing lights, which were objectively real, but when they're seeing these anomalous orbs of light, and then a certain subset starts having more complex hallucinations, because it's Egypt rather than the United States, they're hallucinating the Virgin Mary rather than whatever, space aliens, or what might be more appropriate in another cultural context. So that, roughly speaking, is tectonic strain theory and how Persinger applied it to Zeitoun, which, as you noted, then became a pretty popular explanation. So the skeptic Joe Nickell, in one of his books on religious experience, miraculous phenomena, that was the explanation he adopted for Zeitoun, and other authors in succeeding decades have done the same. So in the book, I've got a chapter on tectonic strain theory where I go through this in much more detail, looking at Persinger's theory and then trying to argue that, in fact, it is not a very good explanation for Zeitoun.
Yeah, do you just want to at least very briefly give a glimpse into some of those reasons? I mean, like, one thing that I found funny was, like, okay, so, like, Persinger was focused on tectonic activity that was like 250 miles away, like 400 kilometers away, which like just so happened to produce highly localized lights just on this church, nowhere else, just on this church, which took a distinctive and discernible form of a woman performing intentional movements of walking around, kneeling before the cross, bird-like objects flying in formation. Together with all the healings, it's like, I don't know, it seems like a pretty long stretch, but I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, well, no, those are good points. And so in the book, I give sort of a twofold assessment of tectonic. So first I say, assuming that tectonic strain theory is basically workable as like a general scientific theory, does it actually help explain Zeitoun? And I try to argue that really, no, it doesn't, but for some of the same reasons you just alluded to, right? Even if tectonic strain theory in general is a good scientific model for group religious experiences, it doesn't account for the very narrow localization of the Zeitoun events, right? If Persinger's theory worked, what you should have expected was like Egypt should have been undergoing like a major UFO flap across the whole country. You wouldn't expect these phenomena to be restricted to the roof of a single church in one little suburb. So it doesn't account for the narrow localization of the events. I don't think it accounts for if Persinger's theory worked, you likewise would have expected that most eyewitnesses would have reported amorphous blobs of light and just amorphous blobs of light, like the objectively real thing that Persinger's theory posits. And then maybe a small minority reporting something more detailed, right? That the minority that has this temporal lobe lability that's going to have more detailed hallucinations. But that's not what you find. What you find is most eyewitnesses are reporting pretty detailed stuff, right? That just does not comport with what Persinger's theory would lead us to expect. So those are a couple of issues that come up with why I think Persinger's theory.
Yeah, and even his psychological claims, if I can just add, like have failed to replicate, and like the amount of electromagnetic radiation in the atmosphere is like less than what you would get from like or comparable or less than what you'd get from like a blow dryer or like using your cell phone.
Well, this is the thing, right? So the other question I ask is, okay, so the first argument I give is like, again, assuming this is a workable theory, does it really help with Zeitoun? I try to argue, no, it doesn't. But then I ask, well, is it actually a workable scientific theory? And I argue that no. Geologists have never confirmed Persinger's hypothesis that the phenomenon of earthquake lights can be prompted by something much lower than an actual earthquake, right? The geological side of his hypothesis has never been confirmed. Moreover, the neuroscience literature of the last 20 years has not been kind to Persinger's theory. A whole variety of neuroscience labs have tried to replicate Persinger's laboratory findings, because Persinger tried to support the neuroscientific component of his theory by setting up in his neuroscience lab these experiments in which he would get his students to put on this equipment. He would flood their craniums with what he hypothesized were like just the right wavelengths of electromagnetic activity. And then a certain proportion of his students would report sort of weird experiences while they were in this sensory deprivation chamber wearing this helmet that was flooding their heads with these electromagnetic wavelengths. Other neuroscience labs just have been unable to replicate Persinger's findings. Moreover, they pointed out that the electromagnetic wavelengths are probably not even able to penetrate the human skull, right? So there's no way they can be affecting the brain at all. So the neuroscientific arguments against tectonic strain theory have just been accumulating over the last 20 years to the point where I think one can confidently say that Persinger's theory is maybe not completely disproved, but it's on much shakier ground than it was, 25, 30 years ago when the theory was getting like a lot of popular media attention. Because for a while, tectonic strain theory, CNN was reporting on it, the BBC was reporting on it, Wired magazine did a long story on it in 1999, in which Persinger talked about Zeitoun as an example of how to apply his theory. So yeah, the succeeding decades have not been kind to his account, in my opinion.
So let's go to the next kind of explanation. I don't want to get into all the Freudian psychoanalysis or like Jungian archetype stuff, but like if someone's trying to give like a more scientifically, naturalistically respectable explanation in terms of mass hysteria or mass delusion or maybe hallucination, purely psychogenic explanations, what do you say to those?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I would point out is that so far as modern psychology is aware, there is no such thing as mass hallucination. If what you mean is like a large group of people, all somehow having private hallucinations, the content of which are the same. So far as modern psychology is aware, that just doesn't happen. This has been nicely pointed out in a recent paper by the Harvard psychologist Tim Lomas. He did a paper for the journal Zeitoun in 2023 where he makes this point that just the concept of mass hallucination is not validated in modern psychology. Moreover, in the book, I do have a chapter, though, regardless, on the concept of mass hallucination and trying to argue that even if it were somehow a legitimate concept, it would not really explain Zeitoun very well. One of the reasons for that is that it does not explain the variations in the phenomena. So one of the things that's striking about Zeitoun is just how unpredictable these events were, right? So like on a given Tuesday, you might have 20,000 people camped around the church. They'd be camped there all night, and nobody sees anything unusual. Even though everybody has high hopes, high expectations, nobody sees anything. Then on the next night, you might have the same number of people, maybe even largely the same group of people, and they see dramatic things, right? The phenomena appears. So you would just get these variations where, the psychological factors from one night to the next would not be radically different. The background of everyone is, of course, going to be the same, right? So the external circumstances are the same. The psychodynamic factors would be unchanged. And yet on some nights, you get the apparition appearing, on other nights not. So I don't see how internal psychodynamic factors would explain that kind of variation. It just doesn't seem to fit. Moreover, I don't think the internal explanations, psychodynamic explanations, would explain some of the fine-grained consistency in the eyewitness reports, right? So you might say, look, if you're going to get large numbers of people having private hallucinations for whatever reason, given that they share a similar cultural background, maybe you'd expect they'd be seeing something similar. Okay, maybe, but it's not going to explain like why multiple independent witnesses report, for example, again, apparition starts out as a thin horizontal line of light, which expands out and takes the form of the Virgin Mary. There's nothing in traditional Coptic iconography or Muslim symbolism about the Virgin Mary which depicts anything like that specifically. So why would there be that kind of consistency across independent eyewitnesses on that particular perceptual factor? And there's other examples one could give along similar lines. So I just don't think that any purely internal psychological explanation is going to account for what was going on.
Yeah, that seems right to me. And then I think let's turn to, I think this is the naturalist's best shot. Some sort of technological hoax, maybe the lights and maybe lights roughly shaped like a woman were produced by some sort of holographic technology. Maybe the lights were powered by, car batteries. Maybe there was some sort of like projector. Maybe white phosphorus was used, or maybe there's some like pyrotechnics or something. What do you make of the kind of technological hoax kind of hypothesis?
Yeah, so I do have a chapter on the notion of a technological hoax. And in fact, I agree with you that if a convincing scientific explanation for Zeitoun is ever found, I think it will be uncovering some kind of shenanigans, some kind of technological hoax. I just don't see what else would account for the data. But I don't think it's likely for a couple of reasons. One is that I just don't think. So if you look at the possibilities of like what might have been used to fake this kind of stuff, I'm not sure that even today, with like Hollywood special effects teams and things, we'd be able to reproduce some of the phenomena that were reported at Zeitoun, especially given its variability, right? That on some nights you get this ball of light that would transform into the image of the Virgin Mary. On other nights you get this amorphous cloud floating over the church that would then assemble into the cloud itself would assemble into the form of the Virgin Mary. Again, you get examples of independent eyewitnesses reporting those different variations on the phenomena. The best shot, I think, is something like a hologram. And in fact, holograms had just been invented a few years earlier, right? The holographic technology was developed in the early 1960s. But I don't think even holograms are a very good explanation for a few reasons. One of which is that holograms, even today, holograms are purely stationary, right? Holograms don't move, whereas the reports of this figure, the eyewitness testimony says that this was a three-dimensional figure that was not just moving, but making intelligent motions, right? Blessing the crowd, bowing before the cross, etc. So the claim is this is a three-dimensional figure that was mobile. And even still today, we don't have mobile holograms. Now, that said, I still think the skeptic's best chance is something like that. And one thing I did not mention in the book, because I didn't want to, I mean, a book on apparitions is already pretty dubious in people's eyes. I didn't want to take too many sort of divergences into the UFO literature. But one thing I will mention is that there have for a long time been rumors floating around, sort of like in ufology world, of claims to the effect that the US government secretly developed mobile 3D holograms as of at least the early 1970s. So if you look, for instance, at books like, so this comes up, for example, in Mark Pilkington's book on UFOs called Mirage Men. In fact, a very interesting book. So anyway, there have been rumors floating around for a long time that there might be secret 3D holographic technology out there that might be sort of secretly utilized by the US government or other world governments. I think that something like that would be probably like the best shot of a naturalistic explanation for Zeitoun. But then you'd have to ask, well, even if this technology existed, how would the Egyptian government have gotten a hold of it, or how would like the Coptic Church have gotten a hold of it? I mean, presumably the U.S. government wouldn't be faking Marian apparitions in Egypt. I mean, what possible motivation would they have for doing that? So again, there are rumors, in my opinion, not particularly well substantiated, but there are rumors about the possibility, possible 3D mobile holographic technology having been secretly developed. But even if that were true, I don't think that would really help all that much with Zeitoun.
I don't have permission to share the individual's name, but I think there was a philosopher who emailed you and mentioned some potential technological hoaxes that might have been pulled off. I don't know if you want to mention any of those proposals.
Yeah, so I have had some correspondence with others who've kind of been floating ideas, which I welcome. So I'm very clear in the book that I encourage additional hypotheses. If skeptics want to come up with new suggestions for possible scientific explanations for Zeitoun, I'm all for it. Happy to engage with further possibilities. And yeah, so I have been corresponding with some folks on sort of looking at possible suggestions. What I've seen so far, I've not been too impressed with, but yeah, I mean, again, I'm happy to look at ideas. This particular fellow had the suggestion that what may have been going on is like an expert climber sort of doing like a parkour type thing up and down the wall of the church to get on the roof and do some things up there. But I'm not sure how feasible that is. I don't know. I did talk in the book about some possible like kind of magic trick explanations that one might put forward and suggest that those really don't work. But like I said, I'm always open to new ideas, new suggestions, and I sincerely do encourage people to come up with new proposals that I'd be happy to look at and talk about.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll just mention a few things from my perspective on the technological hoax hypothesis, because I think this is the naturalist's best bet. One thing to note is that they will have to explain all the data, right? And even if you can come up with something which kind of looks like a strained explanation of the female-shaped figure, you've still got quite a lot ahead of you to explain. You've got to explain the abundant testimonies to intentional movement on the part of this female figure. You've got to explain the three-dimensional character of the female figure, because that's amply attested to. You've got to explain the variable beginnings to the manifestation. I mean, as you mentioned, we literally, I think it was like on the same night that we had like independent testimonies to like the apparition starting out, as like a thin slit of light and then taking the shape, a distinctive female figure shape and whatnot, which is like, whoa, that's a pretty cool convergence. Like that needs to be explained. So variable beginnings, sometimes they testified to the apparition kind of materializing from some of the anomalous clouds, which would also need to be explained. The clouds were described by some witnesses as like rising from the church, taking on like a distinctive kind of brownish, reddish, purplish hue and being associated with a very thick sense of incense, the smell of incense. So maybe we'd also have to postulate that there were like gigantic incense producing machines or something. You'd also have to explain the various different medically attested healings and the medical documentation that we have for those. Like, is the hoax somehow able to cure gangrene? Or like maybe that was just completely fabricated, like the doctor's reports are fake or whatever, And then, of course, you got the flying doves. Like, so somehow the phenomena has to like be able to travel through the atmosphere and like make the lights of the doves, as it were, kind of like materialize and then disappear, because we've got ample testimony to that. Or maybe like those testimonies are just fabricated. I would worry about a lot, like at least trying to accommodate all of the data in a kind of elegant, not like hopelessly implausible story. But
yeah. And the other thing, just to round out the hoax idea, I do briefly get also into the issue of like, I mean, a hoax or a fraud, you might think of as kind of a crime. Okay, well, you're talking about a crime, you want to find, well, who's got motive, means, opportunity. So these technological issues sort of speak to the question of opportunity. Would this actually have been feasible to pull this off, given the technology available in Egypt at the time? But also the question of, like, who's got the motive? And I don't, so the two main culprits would be like the Egyptian government or the Coptic Church. And I argue in the book that just neither of these parties would have had any rational motivation for trying to pull something like this.
Right. You mentioned that like no government in modern history has ever attempted using technology to fake a very public supernatural event like an apparition for political purposes, for instance. It seems like it would have made much more sense for them. This is another point you make. It seems like it would have made much more sense for the government at the time to like fake an apparition of the angel Gabriel on top of a mosque or something. And like, right. It seems like you would need Coptic, you would need some kind of consent or involvement on the part of the Coptic Church. But like, that would be a very bad idea for them, it seems, because like they were a very persecuted, marginalized group at the time in the society. And there would be a significant risk of discovery and then retaliatory violence. There was already violence inflicted upon these people from like the Muslim Brotherhood and whatnot at the time. So like, I don't know, the motives even don't even stack up.
Yeah, and so, I mean, it has been suggested, well, maybe the Egyptian government was running this con in order to try to bring in like tourist dollars from religious pilgrims, because the Egyptian government was in terrible financial straits at the time. But again, like in a 90% Muslim majority country surrounded almost entirely by other 90% Muslim majority countries, if you really want to earn like pilgrimage money, again, fake an apparition of the angel Gabriel on top of a mosque. That'll work much better.
Awesome. So you do have like a kind of argument on the basis of this with premises and a conclusion. So let me share the screen with that, because I think it'll be nice for the audience to just kind of see this worked out in the form of an argument. So maybe could you walk us through this argument?
Sure, yeah. So this is just just like sort of a generic, more formalized argument for like group religious experiences or intersubjective experiences being providing, I think, good evidence against naturalism, right? So premise one, intersubjective experiences are properly taken to provide good evidence for the objective reality of entities or events. That's supposed to just be common sense, right? Generally speaking, in life, if you've got multiple witnesses to some sort of event or entity, if you want to know who shot the butler and you've got 5 witnesses to the butler being shot, that's good evidence for what happened. Premise 2, if intersubjective experiences are properly taken to provide good evidence for the objective reality of entities or events, then by extension, intersubjective religious experiences can be taken to provide good evidence of the objective reality of supernatural entities or events. Preliminary conclusion, premise 3, therefore, by extension, intersubjective religious experiences can be taken to provide good evidence of the objective reality of supernatural entities or events. Now, of course, premise 2, one could question if just sort of by saying that, well, maybe the notion that the general point about intersubjectivity and evidence cannot be extended to supernatural entities or events, right? Maybe because they're just so much more intrinsically unlikely. Maybe the a priori unlikelihood of anything supernatural ever happening means that we can't just take this general point about intersubjective evidence and apply it in a religious context. So maybe intersubjective evidence is great for in a criminal justice context or various other spheres of life, but maybe it just doesn't apply for religion. This is something like the Humean point that, however much evidence you've got for the occurrence of something supernatural, it's always more likely that there's deception or something going on. I'm inclined to think that's just, at least, so there are larger epistemological debates one can have about this. My own view, though, is that from a skeptic's standpoint, if you're trying to convince a religious person to not take this kind of evidence seriously, dismissing it out of hand simply because it deals with the supernatural is not going to be convincing to a religious person. So I think, at least in the context of skeptic religious dialogue, probably best to take premise 2 on board, at least for the sake of argument. Anyway, so just to finish off the line of reasoning, premise 4, if there are well-evidenced cases of such intersubjective religious experiences on record, then metaphysical naturalism is undermined to some degree. Premise 5, there are well-evidenced cases of intersubjective religious experiences on record, like Zeitoun. So final conclusion, therefore, metaphysical naturalism is undermined to some degree, right? Not disproven, right, but undermined to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, do you want to say something about the kind of Humean argument against miracles? I mean, I know there are lots of interpretive difficulties here. Is Hume arguing that no testimony could ever in principle be sufficient to establish a miracle? Was he just talking about, well, in fact, given our ordinary experience and given the quality of evidence, at least of which Hume is aware for miracles, maybe none of that is sufficient to establish a miracle? Do you have any general responses to that kind of Humean critique? Or, I take it that miracles according to Hume are violations of the laws of nature or something like that. But the regularities in reality, the laws of nature are just so amply attested to by our just universal experience that we have much more reason to think that those continued holding in these cases than that they were violated. And so we should just conclude instead that there was some sort of deception or maybe misperception or memory distortion or exaggeration or something like that, instead of thinking that, these overwhelmingly well-confirmed regularities were violated. What do you make of that general line of response?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know, the standard line of response, beginning from Hume's own day, when we had folks responding to his argument, one of the standard lines of response has always been, he's kind of just begging the question, right? But by saying that these universal regularities are truly universal and exceptionless, he is taking it for granted that nobody sees supernatural things happening, because supernatural things don't happen, right? Now, again, to a hardcore settled naturalist who is utterly convinced that the only kind of reality is physical reality, it might be rational to say that any evidence for the supernatural can be dismissed, and fair enough. But again, in terms of the context of religious/naturalist dialogue, that way of dismissing intersubjective evidence, right, group testimony to something supernatural, is just going to not move the needle for the person who is either religious or at least open-minded to the possibility of the supernatural, right? They're just not going to be as inclined to dismiss such reports out of hand. So again, whether or not Hume's got the better of this as in terms of a priori probabilities, I just don't think the Humean argument is a useful move to make in the context of debate with religious people. I don't think that's a move they can really productively use.
Yeah, and come on. Surely some amount of, maybe Hume was just restricting himself to testimony, but surely there is some amount of evidence that would be able to convince you that something supernatural occurred. Like you and all of your friends, right, are watching this. You see this person, you're interacting with them, you feel their leg. They don't have a leg. It's a person who had their leg amputated. And like, you feel the stump. You have videos of the stump beforehand. You have the doctor's notes saying that they amputated it, about a decade ago, signed, notarized. You go and talk to the doctors like, yeah, I know this person. This is my patient. I amputated their leg. Like, dozens of people examine it. Okay, then we take this person to a church. We're all praying around. We literally see a leg magic kind of just instantaneously regrow on that. All of us say this, like, we produce signed, documented reports from doctors afterwards. It was recorded. We look at the recording on our phones. Like, we get experts to, we can cook up the case where it's like, clearly it would be rational to think that a miracle occurred in that case, even though it seems like we would be able to like run a similar argument. It's like, well, hold on a second. Our universal experience is that miracles don't happen. And, you're proposing here a violation of the laws of nature, which just runs contrary to everyone's experience. It's like, come on. Like,
I made basically that same argument in discussion with a pretty well-known atheist philosopher, a very good philosopher, I might add. I made basically that same argument, like, leave aside testimony. What if you yourself personally saw something that was just unambiguously miraculous? And his response to me was, well, then I would know I'd gone crazy, right? His response would have been to just distrust at that point his own faculties or mental competence. Which again, if your prior probabilities are such that like you're an absolutely settled naturalist, in a way, that's a rational response, right? Like, I'm not saying that's a wrong move for like a truly convinced naturalist to make. I just think that kind of attitude again is not going to help in a context of like debate discussion with a religious believer.
Interesting. Yeah, this might get into debates between like subjective and objective Bayesians. Like, I lean sometimes, at least in most moods, lean more towards like objective views where there are like certain objective constraints on priors. And I just think you'd have to have well, we don't need to get into that, but like, I just think arguably those sorts of priors would be irrational, but we don't have to get into that. I think we should maybe at least whet the audience's appetite about your paper on evidentially compelling religious experiences as the kind of like final 5-10-ish minutes, as long as you're cool with that. Maybe you can just tell the audience what you're doing in the paper, what your main conclusion is, and broadly speaking, the contours of how you establish that conclusion in the paper.
Sure, yeah. So what you're referring to is a paper I wrote it was published back in 2016. It was published in what was at the time a very good journal, the European Journal for Philosophy of Religion. Since then, it's become a joke, but it was a very good journal at the time. What I argue in the paper is that I'm making kind of another conceptual distinction between different types of religious experience. So in this case, it's a distinction between sort of religious experiences of a sort that even if they were to happen, they would not automatically undermine, let alone disprove naturalism, right? So an example might be like if I'm praying and all of a sudden I feel this presence around me and I feel great joy and I have this emotional reaction and I think, therefore God exists, right? To the skeptic, they're going to be unimpressed, right? And they're going to be understandably unimpressed because they can give me a litany of potential psychodynamic explanations that might account for that experience. Now, by contrast, so the example I give in the paper is, let's say, different example, I'm praying, I hear a voice tell me, Travis, dodge to the left, there's a bullet about to go through your wall. And I think, oh, okay. I dodge to the left, and half a second later, a bullet whizzes through and narrowly avoids hitting me. In other words, I would have been killed had I not moved out of the way just in time and heeded the warning of this voice. Now, that second experience seems to be qualitatively different in evidential terms, right? If that actually happened as described, you might think, well, that's pretty good evidence for something supernatural having taken place. Now, of course, you could suggest, well, again, maybe you are just going crazy and you heard this voice and it's just a phenomenal coincidence that there was a drive-by shooting happening just at the same time. But then, you can adjust the thought experiment a little bit further and say, the voice said, there's a 357 Magnum bullet about to come through your wall. I dodge to the left, and I dodge to the left, and then later on the police dig the bullet out of the wall, and it turns out to be from a 357 Magnum, and just further support. You can just adjust the case to make the evidential status of the experience rise to the level where, if it actually happened as reported, it would be very difficult to account for convincingly in naturalistic terms. So my suggestion is that there are lots of reported religious experiences that have that evidential status, and I give a number of case studies in the paper designed to illustrate that fact. And I then go on to give an argument to suggest that given that given that such experiences are reported, what is the skeptic to do with them? Well, the position the skeptic is pushed into, ultimately, the hardcore naturalist, the position they're pushed into for those sorts of cases, they have to explain them by way of deception. They have to attribute deception to the people making these reports. That's the only way they can deal with these kinds of reported events. And I make the argument that for most naturalists, that's not a good move to make, because it's actually morally problematic. In other words, we should not accuse people of lying unless we have really good evidence, good reason to do so. And that unless someone's a truly, absolutely convinced, settled naturalist, they cannot morally accuse these people of lying, right? Because if someone's sort of just like on the fence about naturalism, or even like pretty convinced naturalism, but they admit there might be some possible truth to supernatural claims, maybe they're like 85% convinced of naturalism, but they're not totally all the way there. So they're a little bit open-minded to the possibility of religious truth. That kind of a person would have to be really reluctant to automatically attribute deception in cases like this, because that would be morally problematic. I sort of argue it would kind of be a violation of the golden rule. And so I argue that there's this moral reason to be reluctant to rely on claims of deception to explain evidentially compelling religious experiences. And because of that, most naturalists are going to have to, at the very least, approach those experiences with, if they can't outright reject them, maybe they don't want to accept them, but maybe they should at least be on the fence about them. And being on the fence about them is at least sort of pushing them a little bit more towards the non-naturalist end of the spectrum.
Yeah, and just to give the audience just like a sense of what these evidentially compelling religious experiences are like, they take various different forms. Some of them involve, as you mentioned, you were just giving one where it's like, just seemingly like an overwhelmingly improbable event that was pretty valuable in some respect, like saving your life. There are other ones involving like testimonies to just like crazy healings. So like there are multiple accounts. There just are multiple direct eyewitness accounts where people are honestly testifying in broad daylight, totally conducive perceptual circumstances, and testifying to being in the presence of many other witnesses to events like the following. Immediately after prayer, seeing someone with eczematic wounds, so from eczema, however it's pronounced, eczematic wounds all over their arms and legs, instantaneously closing up and disappearing immediately after prayer. We just have multiple kinds of testimonies to that effect, and not just for eczema, but lots of other things. I actually know someone personally. I'll keep them anonymous. I just want to make this for the audience. If you go around and just ask people, especially at like churches, like, hey, have you ever seen a miracle? Do you at least know someone who has like directly experienced a miracle? Like, you will get a lot of these evidentially compelling reports. That's not to say that you should like believe all of them, but it seems like it might kind of unsettle the settled naturalist. So here's one of them I'll just mention. I'll keep the person anonymous because I haven't asked permission to share locations or names or whatever. But someone I know was a prison chaplain when two inmates were allowed to box each other. In the boxing match, one of the prisoners just completely broke his nose, and it was visibly mangled and kind of hanging off to the side by like roughly a 45-degree angle. 5 minutes after the nose breaking, this chaplain, whom I know, heard a voice telling him to pray for the prisoner's nose. He first ignored the voice, but he heard it a second time, ignored it again, and then heard it a third time, and was like, okay, I can't ignore this. So then he asked the prisoner if he could pray for the healing of his nose. And according to the person that I know, this was in front of several witnesses, my friend prayed for the prisoner's nose to heal. And over the course of around 5 seconds, all of the witnesses in the room visibly saw in broad daylight his nose go back into its normal position and the swelling completely dissipate. And when the emergency personnel arrived, they were told to leave because they weren't needed anymore. And there are various other details that I could get into. Again, and that's just like someone that I know. And I only recently learned this. I was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And it turns out that there just like are accounts like this, which are testified to by like seemingly and demonstrably honest people.
And
like, you just have, if you're a naturalist, you just kind of like have to say, like, okay, were they seriously, honestly mistaken about seeing a nose? Multiple people around seeing a nose just like move back into place. It just seems like you have to say they're lying.
Yeah, and I've heard similar. I mean, not necessarily healing miracles, but similarly dramatic reports from people I trust that would certainly, if they're telling the truth, they'd count as an evidentially compelling religious experience. So, yeah, these sorts of things are not as uncommon as one might suppose. And if you really dig into some of the literature on this, so I don't know, pick up something like Craig Keener's 2-volume works on miracles, and just by the time you've plowed through your whatever 200th well-evidenced healing miracle report, I mean, different people have different reactions to these things, but some people will just, the sheer weight of some of this testimony will eventually begin to affect one's probability assessments, I think.
Yeah, and I mean that's been my main thing here, which is my claim isn't even that this is like proof of theism or anything like that. I'm not saying that for the audience. My point is just that it seems like this should at least unsettle someone who is a settled, comfortable naturalist. Like they've read their Graham Oppie, they've read their David Papineau, they've read all this stuff. They have various abstract, indeed good philosophical reasons to accept naturalism, and maybe they're quite settled in that. But then you just look at these accounts, and it's very hard to say from the armchair that you just know that all of these cases, they're either like lying or just like very weird, somehow honest mistakes happened in front of like bunches of people in totally conducive perceptual environment where the people are just like demonstrably not mentally ill. And you could just tell that. You can divine that from the armchair. I don't know. Actually, at least to me, when I first started researching these sorts of things, when I learned about your book and I started reading into these sorts of things, it has unsettled me. I have been unsettled. I've not been fully convinced, but I've been unsettled. I can say that. Well, do you have any final closing remarks, Travis, concluding comments to kind of tie up our conversation?
Thank you for that last remark. I know it's not easy to admit when one's philosophical positions get unsettled. Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss this material. If folks are interested in the book, it's available in print form, either on Amazon or from St. Vladimir Seminary Press, the publisher. There's an audio version of it available. If you've got an Audible subscription, you can get the audio version, and there's also now an Arabic translation out. So if that's your first language and you want to read it in Arabic, that can be arranged.
Cool. That's awesome. Okay, well, I've linked in the description for the audience, I've linked the book where you can get it. I've linked to some of of Travis's work, including the paper on evidentially compelling religious experiences. I really enjoyed it. Definitely check out Travis's work in the description. Thanks, Travis, for coming on. And of course, what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.